Okay, so focus is, what does it mean to be multicellular, a truly multicellular organism? Okay, how does that work? And we're going to look at our main example of that, which is actually something we looked at through the microscope on Monday, and that is the leaf in cross section. Okay, the layers of the leaf. Right, I'll show you a picture, kind of like what we looked at, and show you, here's these layers, they all look different, here's their job, these are examples of cells working together in a multicellular organism. The key part of that is the cells are specialized. Okay? Specialization is the hallmark, the cornerstone of being a multicellular organism. Okay, so that is a word that would have to be included in any explanation of multicellular organisms. What does it mean? Okay, well, specialization means that the cells in your body are not all the same. Okay, in a truly multicellular organism, there are groups of cells that do a certain job. There are other groups of cells that do another job. Okay, and another group of cells that do another job. Okay, specialization makes things even more efficient. But to be specialized, what kind of cells do you have to have? We talked about two different kinds. They have to be eukaryotic. Okay? Eukaryotic cells are the ones that have all the organelles. Specialization basically means altering the structure and contents of the cell to do that job better. Right? So, as an example, your muscle cells would have way more of those microfibers, microfilaments, they'd have more than one nucleus, and they would have tons of mitochondria. Okay? Because a muscle has got to be stretchy, and it's got to, in case it tears, have more than one nucleus, and it uses a ton of energy, so it needs to have lots of mitochondria. It's specialized for that job. Okay? Meanwhile, the cells that are your epidermal cells, well, they're pretty plain Jane, right? They just kind of have a few organelles here or there. Okay, they're a bit elastic, but not as elastic as your muscle cells are. They're specialized basically just to seal the inside of you from the outside of you, right? So they're going to look different. Specialization is what makes something truly multicellular. Okay, all right. So that word will be important. Okay, let's talk a little bit of evolution here. Okay, so multicellularity is not like why a plant cell and an animal cell look alike. Okay, plant cell and animal cell look alike because they had a common ancestor. Okay, everyone with me there? Okay, that common ancestor gave them the things that they have. Multicellularity has actually evolved independently in many groups of organisms. 3 of them are still living today. There are a couple of groups of multicellular organisms that died. Okay, they went extinct. Right? But 3 groups survive today: plants, animals, fungi. Okay? Multicellularity evolved separately. Okay? There was not a shared common multicellular ancestor for those 3 groups. Okay? So that tells you, if it evolved separately, it's got to be good. Okay? What would be the advantage to being multicellular versus being a single-celled organism?
Yeah, really big.
Yeah, that is the #1 advantage. Okay, if a single-celled organism gets really big, thinking back to our cell size activity that PS is due tomorrow at 8:30, okay, what happens when you get big? If you're single-celled, what's the struggle? Oh, sorry, great, I thought you were putting your hand up.
Diffusion.
Diffusion, yeah. If you get really big, your volume is going to get really big compared to your surface area, and you're not going to be able to transport materials quickly enough, and quite frankly, you'll die. Okay? But being multicellular means you can be made of all those little cells. You can grow and just make more cells, and you can keep that healthy surface area to volume ratio. And if you're multicellular and you have specialization, you might have groups of cells that help to actively move materials for you, just like you do. You have a circulatory system. Okay? All the cells that make up your circulatory system are specialized to either pump blood or conduct blood through your body. Okay, is everyone kind of following me there? So the main advantage of being multicellular, get big. Okay? Bigger you are, the less things try to kill you. Okay? I mean, that's what it comes right down to, right? Size has generally been better. Okay? Bigger has generally been better, except for a few circumstances, like mass extinctions where small might have been better. All right, everybody with me there? Okay. Now, on the note of evolution, we got to talk a little bit about, we're in a Catholic school. Okay? How many people in here think that the Catholic Church says evolution is wrong? Okay. It's pretty common for us to think that because the church for a very long time did think that. Okay? Charles Darwin was not welcome at church. Okay? He got himself in a lot of trouble for his theory of evolution. Okay? More recently, institutions are allowed to grow and change. Okay? Pope Francis came in and quite openly stated that no, the Catholic Church has no problem with the idea of natural selection causing evolution. Okay? So the Catholic Church does not have a problem with that idea. Here's why. Here's how Pope Francis explained it. First, number one, God's a pretty smart guy. Number two, he knew that his creation would change. Okay? Earth hasn't been the same through its 4.5 billion years of existence. It has undergone massive cataclysmic changes. Life has persisted through those changes. Okay? If he did not give life the mechanism by which to adapt and change to those changing conditions, the life he put on this earth would be dead long, long ago. Okay? So the idea that the church takes with regards to natural selection and evolution, it is the mechanism through which God's creation is allowed to adapt and persist and change and improve, okay, throughout time. Okay? The reason lots of people think that the church has a problem with evolution is because of Genesis. Okay? In the book of Genesis, how long did it take God to make the earth?
7 days.
6 days. He rested on the seventh, right? The seventh is the holy Sabbath day, right? In the Jewish faith, the Sabbath day is like super important. Okay? So 6 days. Is that meant to be taken literally? Some groups of Catholics do believe that it is meant to be taken literally. There's lots of other faiths where, yes, the literal word of the Bible is truth. Okay? That's called fundamentalism. Some people believe that. Okay? The Catholic Church from the Vatican says, no, we understand that the Bible is often metaphor. Okay? Jesus himself spoke in parables, right? He told stories to teach lessons. Doesn't mean those stories actually happened. He was just trying to teach people something. Okay? Because during the time when the Bible was written, that's how people were taught. Most people were illiterate. There was no formal education system. Okay? Most people's lives was strictly, I got to get food on the table so me and my family don't starve. Okay? There wasn't time for anything else. So the way people learned was through storytelling. Okay? There was a lot of oral history that went on. So most people were not educated, they weren't literate. They would never have understood you if you had stood, in the center of town and said, so 4.5 billion years ago, all these gases coalesced in the center of our solar system under gravity, and under the weight of gravity, nuclear fusion started, and the sun was born, and then this nebular cloud that surrounded that central mass started to coalesce into individual planets. They would have looked at you and gone, where are the rocks? Because we got to stone that guy, because he talks crazy. Okay? I mean, that's really what they would have done in that time. If you read in the Bible that somebody got stoned, it means they had rocks thrown at them until they were dead, not the other kind of get stoned. That's different, okay? So yeah, in the Bible it means something else, okay? So you wouldn't have wanted that. So they had to explain incredibly complex and grandiose things like creation in simpler terms and use analogy and metaphor. And that's how we're meant to interpret things like Genesis. It's a metaphor, okay? It didn't happen in 6 days, but if you actually look at what it says in the Bible and what we know from science, the order is actually the same. Okay? What's the first thing? Let there be light. Would the Big Bang have been pretty bright? Yeah. And what was also the first thing to form in our solar system? The sun, the light. Okay? And then separate the heavens from the earth. Well, the Earth formed out of the heavens, out of this cloud of dust that surrounded the sun. Okay? And then separate the land from the sea. Okay? As time went by and the Earth cooled, precipitation rained down and began to collect in the low-lying areas of that big ball of rock. Okay? And it formed the oceans and it formed the land. Okay? So it all goes in the right order. Okay? Then you populate the sea and the air and the land with animals and plants, and then what's the last thing? Who got created on the sixth day? Yeah, we did. Okay? And then God went, whew, that was a lot of work. All right, we take a day off now. Okay? And that was it, right? We're kind of the pinnacle of, so far at least, the evolution on our planet. Okay? It all goes in the same order. So it's absolutely okay to treat that part of the Bible as metaphor. Okay? Sort of making sense? Okay, so if we look at what kind of actually happened in terms of life appearing and evolving on Earth, okay, we got to go back almost 14 billion years, okay? Almost 14 billion years ago to the Big Bang, right? So the physics and the math of the early universe is pretty complex, okay? Stephen Hawking was once quoted as saying that the early math and physics of the universe is so complex as to prove that God exists. Okay? He actually said it because it was like really, really crazy. Right? So we know there was at least some sort of singularity that exploded forth, and all of the matter that now makes up the universe was thrown asunder. Okay? And then we would have massive expansion. That's the inflation part there. Okay? A bit of a cooling or a dark age when that energy is dissipating. Okay? The first generation of stars would have coalesced out of that. They would have been very big and very short-lived. Okay? And then we'd have gotten their black holes that would have formed from that. Okay? And then kind of stellar evolution that goes on. Okay? To where our Milky Way forms, things like that. And then we'll kind of skip a little bit to the Milky Way spiraling, and then where our solar system came from. Okay, so our solar system came from some much larger star going supernova. Okay, it exploded and it threw out into space all the stuff that would become our solar system. Okay, over billions of years from there, okay, that coalesced into the sun and a protoplanetary disk. That would be all the planets in the disk that they reside in. Now, as that goes on, okay, gravity starts to attract objects together. Okay, so gravity works like this: if you have mass, you have gravity. Okay, so even you have gravitational pull. It's pathetic and couldn't attract a piece of dust floating in the air towards you, but you have it. All mass does. So any two masses floating around in space might be attracted to each other, orbit each other, and then eventually smash into each other. And when they do that, they might stick. Okay? And eventually they'll get bigger and bigger, because as something gets more massive, more things get pulled towards it. Okay? We call that accretion theory. Now, what we sort of theorize to have happened with Earth at least, is that Earth had formed and was nearly to the point where its crust had cooled and solidified. The problem was, in Earth's orbit was another object. It was about the size of Mars, and it's called Theia. Theia smashed into the Earth. Okay? Earth was not as big then as it is now. Okay? Theia smashed into the Earth. Now, it wasn't a head-on collision like this. Okay? It was more of a glancing blow. Right? Kind of like if you're playing pool and you want to angle a ball, you don't hit it straight on, or it goes straight. You hit it on the side and it kind of pushes it to the side. That's kind of the impact that we had. But it was enough that Theia was annihilated. Okay? It just disintegrated, and its core was absorbed into the now remolten Earth. Okay? That's why Earth has such a strong magnetic field. It's got a really thick, heavy iron core. Okay? In fact, you saw the evidence of it if you looked outside last night, and you can see them again tonight. They're the auroras, yeah. Okay? That is our magnetic field in action. It is a big shield. Okay? It's like a science fiction shield that is protecting you from the awful crap that the sun is spitting our way right now. Okay? There's like a class 5 solar storm going on, so the sun's puking out a bunch of really nasty stuff, and our big magnetic shield is deflecting it and keeping it away. But what happens when those particles hit the magnetic field is they get slowed down. And when they get slowed down, they release energy as light. We learned about that back in the chemistry unit. Okay, so we're seeing the evidence of that energy being absorbed by our magnetic field as ribbons of light or curtains of light as they fall and slow down. Making sense? Okay, so Earth got its big core from this impact. This is also where Earth got its moon from, because before that, Earth didn't have a moon. Because it was a glancing blow, all of Thea's surface material was thrown in a cloud of debris that was then reattracted to the Earth by gravity. So there came this debris cloud around the Earth. Now, you wouldn't want to have been on Earth after this. For about 1,000 years, it literally rained fire. Okay, because pieces of Theia kept falling down on the Earth. Okay, but a lot of pieces of Theia coalesced, got attracted by gravity to each other, and formed the moon. Okay, this is why the moon is so light. Okay, for an object its size, the moon is ridiculously light, and it's because it doesn't have a thick iron core. Theia's core got absorbed into the Earth, so the moon doesn't really have as big a core as it should. So it's actually a lot lighter than other moons its size, and our moon is big. Okay, like really big for a planet our size. Okay? So it's a lot lighter because it's made of the surface material of Earth and Theia. That's why when they brought the rocks back from the moon, because we did actually land on the moon, okay, that we brought those rocks back, we found they're the same age as the Earth, and they're made of the same material. Why? Because they had the same origin, okay? The two bodies that collided. Okay, now, as interesting as that is, having a moon was really important for development of life on Earth. Okay, now, when the moon first formed, it was a lot closer. Okay? The moon is actually getting further and further away every year. We'll eventually lose it, but don't worry, you'll never see it. Okay? It only gets 2 centimeters further away every year. Okay? But, I mean, over 4.5 billion years, that adds up. Okay? The moon has a really important effect on the rotation of the Earth, the tilt of the Earth, and even the Earth's orbit around the sun. Okay? Because they're gravitationally attracted to each other. Right? They move towards each other, okay, away from each other as the moon goes around. It also pulls on part of the Earth. What part of the Earth does it pull on? Yeah. It pulls on the ocean. It causes tides. Okay? So as the Earth rotates under the moon, the water moves towards the moon, and then the Earth rotates away, the water comes back. But whatever side is closest to the moon is going to have high tides. Okay? Now, if you can imagine the moon being way closer to the Earth, okay, would the tides have been a lot bigger? Yeah, and when the moon was closer to the Earth spun faster. Okay? As the moon moves away, it's actually causing the Earth to slow down. Our days are actually getting slightly longer all the time. Not enough that we'll ever notice the difference in our lifetime, but it's happened. So if you can imagine, when the moon first formed, on Earth, days were about 8 hours. Okay? Like, I don't mean day was 8 hours, I mean like a full turn of the Earth. So day was 4 hours, night was 4 hours. Okay? So you got the moon pulling on the ocean, you got the Earth spinning around and around like a top underneath it. What's happening to the ocean? Slosh. Okay? Like, imagine you have a bucket of water and it's full and you just violently shake it back and forth. Okay? What's going to happen to the water? It's going to spill everywhere. Okay? So if you can imagine, like, tides at that time would have been, the Atlantic Ocean could have come from where it is now to Saskatchewan. Okay? I mean, the moon's a lot closer, Earth's spinning a lot faster, tides were a lot different. And what that did is it spread out nutrients, okay, and the things that life needs out a lot, and it constantly brought in a refresh of nutrients and oxygen and water, and that's where the conditions were good for life to first appear. Okay, so that's the moon's effect. So we're looking here, guys, and what are we at here for time? So 3.7 billion years ago is right about here. So right about here, okay, would be 4.14 billion years ago or so. Okay, and here at the end of the late heavy bombardment, we see the last universal common ancestor, or LUCA. LUCA is that organism from which plants and animals evolved. Okay, the last universal common ancestor. Single-celled prokaryotic organism, okay, that diverged. Okay, so remember that this is about 4.1 billion years ago here. Okay, we'll see the first DNA-filled prokaryotic cells around 3.9 billion years. First truly photosynthetic cells, okay, around, let's say, 3.9 billion years ago or so. Okay, we'll get stromatolites. They're these layers that we found in the fossil record that contain mats of blue-green algae, okay, a photosynthetic bacteria. Okay, and then we kind of keep following here, right? We've got kind of all of these things that we won't really address too much. Okay, when we get to here, okay, we get a few impacts along the way. Those obviously kind of set things back a little bit, but right here is kind of a key time. Okay, the Huronian Ice Age. The Huronian Ice Age was the result of, it kind of looks backwards here, but okay, the Great Oxygenation. Imagine, we got photosynthetic cells here. Okay, we don't really have a lot of chemoheterotrophic organisms. The only things that would be around would be things that would eat decomposers, no animals for sure, right? Yeah, there's still no multicellular organisms. So the main organisms on Earth are all photosynthetic. And all they need is carbon dioxide, which is basically the whole atmosphere, okay, and sunlight and water. There would be a lot of all of those things. So they did really, really well for, well, 1.5 to 2 billion years. They actually caused a kind of toxic tipping point in the atmosphere. They kept consuming carbon dioxide and they kept pumping out oxygen. Now remember, oxygen is their waste product and it reached levels that were toxic to them. Okay? It just got to a point where suddenly there was too much of it. Okay? And it killed off 90+% of all organisms on Earth because their own waste products built up to a point where they were toxic. Okay? Now, mass extinction events are often looked at as bad, but they're good in this way. Whatever survives is really going to change things, and it's going to have the whole world to itself. Okay, so after this big ice age, sometimes this is called the snowball Earth time. Okay, after that, we actually see the first eukaryotic organisms. Okay, so those first cells that have a nucleus and all of that kind of stuff. Okay, and then right after that, surprise, surprise, the earliest multicellular organisms. Once that happens, everything just kind of takes off. Okay, once there's multicellular organisms, there are niches everywhere that need filling, and they can fill them. Okay, so we'll see, we got cyanobacteria, okay, we got all these other things going on, okay, and then we'll get down to about here. So now, here's where the first animals are. 0.75 billion years ago, so 750 million years ago. So basically, Earth has been around for 4 billion years without any animals on it. Okay? Animals are some of the last things to have appeared, large multicellular organisms. Okay? Obviously, multicellular plants have been around a little longer than that. Okay? But our animals are only this recent. Okay? And once you get to there, okay, you get more organisms starting to form, and then those animals become more and more complex. Okay, about 0.45 billion years ago, right after the Cambrian explosion. The Cambrian explosion is an explosion of diversity of animals in the ocean. Okay, 450 million years ago, plants make it onto land. So imagine, all of this part of history, 4 billion years worth of Earth's history, nothing has been alive on land. It's all been in the ocean. So are there a lot of opportunities on the land that nobody took? Yeah. So once you move to land, it's like, hey, sweet, I got my own country and I can do whatever I want with it right now, okay, because I'm the only person here. Okay, so they would explode as well, and then we see kind of all of that stuff going on from there. Right, right here, there's the end of the dinosaurs, right, the Chicxulub impact, okay, all that kind of stuff. Making sense? So multicellularity showing up pretty late to the party. Okay? Because a lot of stuff had to happen for the conditions to be right for that to even appear. And it's highly complex. okay, is kind of the point of this history lesson. Okay, is that multicellularity is very, very complex, okay, but it's also the result of a lot of, well, trial and error from nature. Okay. That organism there has more than one cell. Is it multicellular? Okay, so each one of these things is a cell, right? Are they all the same? Is that multicellular then? Because if you're multicellular, you have to have, starts with S, specialization. This is a colonial aggregate. Okay? Some organisms can join together and work together, but they're not a multicellular organism because there's no division of labor, no specialization. Okay? That is that cornerstone of being multicellular. Okay? All right. Okay, so as multicellularity kind of appeared, it evolved rapidly after that, because once it was established, it was like, holy smoke, this is really good. It was like inventing the wheel. Okay, it just, everything kind of rolled from there. We can see in these pictures here, these are some of the like artist's impressions of early Earth. Okay, look how big the moon is in those pictures. Okay, big because it was close, yeah. Okay, now another impact and another thing that actually helped with the evolution of life on Earth was the moon being so close actually resulted in greater seismic activity, more volcanism. Okay, because with the moon being that close, it doesn't just pull on the ocean, it pulls on the Earth too. Okay, and that can actually result in, like if you had like clay. This isn't clay, it's sticky tack, but you get the idea. Okay, so for the Earth, if the moon is here, it's going to pull on the Earth and stretch it. Not that much, obviously, but it's going to stretch it. Okay, and since the Earth is rotating under the moon, a new part gets stretched toward the moon as the Earth rotates underneath. Okay, if you keep like working a piece of clay, eventually it gets what? It gets hot. Yeah. Okay, and the reason it gets hot is as you're kind of kneading it like that, the individual clay particles are rubbing against each other, okay? Creating a lot of friction, a lot of heat, and you're stretching it and then compressing it and stretching it and compressing it, okay? Well, if that's a planet, you're squeezing it and then you're pulling it and you're gonna tear the planet and stuff is gonna come out from inside, okay? How many of you are familiar with Jupiter's moons? Okay, like Io is that one that's really close and it's highly volcanic. Okay, well, it's like that because it's small, Jupiter is huge, it's really close to Jupiter, and Jupiter does exactly the same thing. It pulls on that moon and squeezes it, okay, and it rotates and squeezes it, okay, and it's constantly making it volcanic. Okay, the same thing would have been true on early Earth, and volcanoes put out lots of stuff that organisms can use, if they're not destroyed, obviously. All right. I'm going to give you guys a little break here, and then we're going to talk about the layers of the leaf. Okay, so I'll give you about give you till 12:57. Okay, so give you 5 minutes here. Okay, get out, walk around, talk to each other. All right, so what we're going to look at now is our example, or our exemplar of specialization in a multicellular organism. Our exemplar is actually going to be what we looked at through the microscopes on Monday, the layers of the leaf. Okay, so when we looked at the plant cell, what we saw were cells that looked like this here on the right. Okay, and we were, of course, at that time most concerned with those rectangular ones that are at the top. Okay, well, they're only one group of cells within the leaf. Okay? Within the leaf, there are a whole bunch of different kinds of cells, and they all do a different job. Okay? The ones we looked at that we were concerned with are part of what we call the palisade layer. Okay? The palisade layer's job is to carry out photosynthesis. We pack in as many cells as possible into as small an area as possible, and they're full of chloroplasts. We could see them when we looked through the microscope, right? All those little greenish ovals, okay? They were full of those. That's because their sole purpose, they are specialized to carry out photosynthesis. So they are packed close together, they have a regular shape, and they're full of chloroplasts. Okay, with me so far? All right, but if we look at the cells above them look a lot different. In fact, they look like they have no chloroplasts, right? All of these palisade cells are fairly green, okay, but these cells are practically clear. Well, they have a different job. Right? The cells down below the palisade layer, okay, right in here, they're all kind of irregularly shaped. They have chloroplasts in them, but they have a different job. Right? So what we're going to go over here are the layers of the leaf, and what each layer does. That is something you will need to be able to regurgitate for me, okay, on an exam when I ask you, hey, is this, when I'm talking about a multicellular situation, you can tell me, to be truly multicellular, an organism has to have specialization. A plant is a good example of this because it has this layer that does this and this layer that does this, and you can show me that you understand how specialization works and that these are examples of specialized cells working together. Okay, does that make sense? So if you don't have the notes package, or even if you do, you might want to make a few notes in it. Okay, if you don't have the notes package, you're going to want to write down a few of these functions. Okay, let's start at the top of the leaf. Okay, the top layer of the leaf, and actually the very bottom, they're the same. Okay, is the upper. Well, is called the epidermis. Obviously, we're dealing with the top one right now, so the upper epidermis. The upper epidermis has one specialized job, and that is to secrete the cuticle. Okay, so you can see waxy cuticle is here. That's secreted by the upper epidermis. And I wouldn't even care if you had upper there, because upper and lower do the same thing. If you just said epidermis secretes the cuticle. Now, what's the purpose of a cuticle? Anybody know? It's not the same as the one in your fingernails. Okay, well, it is waxy. Like, that part is accurate. Leaves have to be sealed against the outer environment. Okay? So the upper epidermis secretes wax, and the wax just kind of fills in and covers and seals all the cells, top and bottom of the leaf. Okay? Now, this waxy cuticle is basically the same as chapstick. Okay, so remember, like the original chapstick, right? It was basically just wax, right? And you would put it on your lips, and then moisture couldn't escape through it. You basically put a sealed layer on your lips, and then they would, regain moisture if they were chapped, because water wouldn't evaporate through them. Well, the leaf is basically covered in a layer that's like chapstick, right? And that's why water hits it and beads and runs off. What part of the plant is responsible for absorbing water? The roots, yeah, not the leaves. Okay, if the leaves were responsible for absorbing water, they'd be like a sponge. Okay, as soon as water hit them, they'd swell up. It doesn't do that. Right? The leaf has to be sealed, because if it isn't, this is the part that's out in the sun and in the air and in the wind all the time. What would happen to it if it wasn't sealed? It would dry up really fast. Okay? Has anyone ever seen what happens to a moss if it gets exposed to the sun? It gets crunchy, and like within like minutes, because a moss doesn't have a waxy cuticle. Okay? It doesn't have that. That's why it always grows in the shade. You never see it anywhere else, because it wouldn't survive in direct sunlight. Okay? If this didn't have the waxy cuticle, water would evaporate from the entire surface, which would dry it out very quickly. Okay? So the waxy cuticle, okay, is there to seal off the leaf and prevent evaporation. Everybody with me on that? So that's the job of the epidermis, is to secrete this cuticle that prevents evaporation. Pretty important job. All right, below the upper epidermis is the palisade layer that we were talking about before. Okay, the palisade layer just carries out photosynthesis. Okay, lots of chloroplasts in there, and they're packed in there. Okay. So if you want like an analogy of how the palisade layer looks, if you've ever bought a package of hot dogs, okay, imagine you like turn it up so that they're stacked long like this. They're packed right in there like that. And they, a hot dog's not perfectly round in that situation. It's kind of got flattened sides because they're pushed together like that. The palisade layer is like that. They're squished in there. And they're very rectangular because they're squished together. Okay? Lots and lots of chloroplasts, carries out photosynthesis. Now, below that, okay, you can see that the cells become very irregular in shape. Right? This is the spongy layer. Okay? Because the cells are irregular, we can see in this diagram that there are actually spaces in between them. They don't fit tight together. Those spaces allow for the exchange of gases. So that would be CO2, okay, oxygen, and even water. Okay, now you might be thinking, Coderre just talked about this waxy layer that prevents and seals the leaf up so that nothing gets out. So how is it supposed to exchange gases if it's sealed off? Well, right underneath the spongy layer is the lower epidermis. But the lower epidermis has structures in it that the upper doesn't. Okay? And those structures are stomates. Okay? And a stomate is made up of two guard cells. We'll talk here in a minute about how the stomate and guard cells work, but they're part of that lower epidermis, and they can open and close. Okay? When they're open, the gases can be exchanged. Water can evaporate only through those little holes. Okay? When they close off, none of that happens. Okay? All right, so if I ask you a question about multicellularity, talk about the layers of the leaf, okay? The upper epidermis is basically transparent. There are no chloroplasts. Its only job is to secrete a waxy cuticle that coats and seals the leaf. The layer under that is the palisade layer. Cells are full of chloroplasts. They're packed tight together. It's the upper layer so that it's exposed to the sun, right? We want that upper layer to be in the sunshine, okay? The layer below that, the spongy layer, still carries out some photosynthesis, but not its main job. Irregularly shaped cells create gaps. In the gaps is where gases can be exchanged. Okay? And then below that, the lower epidermis secretes a cuticle and houses the stomates. Okay? Stomates are on their own another example of specialized cells. So we'll talk about that in a minute here. Okay? Stomates are like pores. Okay? Like you have pores in your skin, they're kind of like that. And they can open and close. Right? But it's not something the plant can do consciously. Right? The plant doesn't have a brain. Everything has to be kind of automated. So the way a stomate works is it's made up of two guard cells. Okay? And the guard cells fit together kind of like this, kind of like my hands are right now. So each guard cell is kind of shaped like a bean. Okay? They're shaped like that when their water vacuoles are full. Okay? So guard cells are specialized to change their shape based on how much water is in their water vacuoles. So in the morning, the stomates are open, vacuoles are full, guard cells are bean-shaped. As the day goes by, more water evaporates through the stomate. When water evaporates, what gets left behind? Like if you boiled off a bunch of water in a pot at home, what would be left inside the pot? Minerals. Yeah, exactly. Remember, plants aren't using distilled water here. They're pulling this water out of the dirt. It's got tons of minerals and salts and things like that in it. So as that water evaporates through the stomates, the salt gets left behind in the spongy layer. Now, if there's a bunch of salt there, what transport process did we talk about would start to happen if there was a salt imbalance? Osmosis. Okay, so suddenly there's a bunch of salt surrounding these guard cells. Water starts getting pulled out of the guard cells by osmosis. There's nothing they can do to stop that. So their water vacuole will start to empty and they can't hold that shape anymore. Then they close the stomate. Okay, it happens naturally. Okay, the plant doesn't have to think about it. Okay, it doesn't have to send a signal, close the stomate, it's getting thirsty. Okay, it just happens. Okay, the water is drawn out of the guard cells by osmosis, okay, and they close off. Right? Is that another example of specialization? Okay? And you could even work in a cellular transport example. I feel an application question coming on here. Okay, remember I said you get application questions on cell transport? Okay, there's an example, right? That's an application. All right, so let's talk about those stomates here. Okay, so there's lots of different diagrams of the layers of the leaf. If you go into the notes package, even if you don't have it printed, you'll see those same diagrams. Okay, so we got the palisade layer, upper epidermis, spongy layer. You can see all the gaps in there. Okay, you got the stomates here in the lower epidermis, and you also see the veins. And whenever you look at a leaf, you can actually see the veins running through the leaf. Those veins are the phloem and the xylem, which we'll talk about more tomorrow. Okay, they carry water and sugar. Okay, so they're the tubes, okay, that carry all that stuff. They go into the leaves, obviously. All right, so this picture here on the left, this is actually an electron microscope picture of the layers of the leaf. So you can see here, this is the palisade layer. Okay, so all the cells are kind of rectangular and they're just packed right in there. Right here, this is a vein. Okay, these cells here on the outside, that's the phloem. These cells on the inside, that's the xylem. Right, and then you can see here, surrounding that vein is the spongy layer. Look at all the gaps in the spongy layer. Right, all of those can be filled with carbon dioxide, oxygen, water. It's where the exchange takes place. That gas exchange is crucial. These cells up here are carrying out photosynthesis. They need carbon dioxide. They're pumping out oxygen, and all the while water's got to evaporate to facilitate that process. Okay? So they're all working together. They all have a job, and they all do that job well. Okay? In a multicellular organism, there are no cells that are like a jack of all trades. Okay? There are only masters of one. Every group of cells is a master of one process. Can they do the others? Yes, but they're really good at this one, and everybody depends on them to do that one. Okay, making sense? All right, well, let's talk about the stomates. In fact, before I talk about the stomates, copy down what's on this slide because it explains how the stomates work. If you don't have the notes package, try and draw a representation of this diagram on the right. Okay, because that's how those very specialized guard cells work. All right, so I'll give you a few minutes to kind of catch up with it. If you do have the notes package, you're going to add a few things when I talk about it here. Okay, are there any other questions on how the guard cells work there? Okay, the water moving in when there's lots of it, okay, and very little salt outside, and then throughout the day, more salt outside, water moves to the salt by osmosis. Okay. All right, I would like you guys to please copy down those questions, and I'm going to give you some time to answer them. Okay, I'd like, few good complete sentences for each one. All right, and then, we'll go through them together in a little bit. Okay, so the epidermis and the stomates have similar jobs. So those similar jobs would be that they both either prevent or control what? Well, they're related to osmosis for sure, but we can't prevent that at all. It's just going to happen. But the osmosis is what opens and closes the stomate. What gets out?
They prevent water loss.
Yeah, they prevent water loss. They prevent evaporation, right? The cuticle, which is what the epidermis secretes, seals the leaf. It completely prevents evaporation. The stomates can open and close, so they more control it than they prevent it. But they have the same job, controlling loss of water. Okay. All right, and then describe how the stomate works. Well, we've gone over that a couple of times, right? That is something that's related to those cells being specialized to be able to change their shape, respond to changes in osmotic pressure. Okay, that osmotic pressure is from salts being concentrated in one area and water trying to move that way. All right, everybody with me there? Okay, so that's what we're looking at, right? For number one, it was they can get bigger, they can overcome that surface area to volume ratio, overcome the diffusion problem, and maybe even, okay, they might even have specialized cells that help them to move materials. Okay, do you have specialized cells in your body that help you move materials? They're all part of what system? Your circulatory system, right? Your heart, your blood vessels, they pump the blood, they move it to places, okay? And then, like we said, the cells of the leaf different from the cells of it, well, they're specialized to do different jobs, okay? All right, we still have some time left here, okay? What I would suggest you do with that time would be to talk to your group mates with regards to the lab that's due tomorrow morning, right? The lab activity, sorry, that's due tomorrow morning, and the cell anatomy lab that's due next week. Okay, we need to talk about any of the questions or the analysis with each other. Okay, now would be a good time to do that. Let's make good use of our remaining 12 minutes or 10 minutes or so here.